So, here is the $100,000 question, or to use Powerball, the $1.7 billion question. All right? Does this mean that I've got to prepare 20 different lessons for 20 different students? Oh, what happened to my, oh, there it goes. It went out of order. Okay, so the answer is no way, okay? But here you go. What we're trying to focus on here is that we're really addressing the same concepts, at least core informational pieces. The difference would be the degree of complexity, all right? And it's also based on these other considerations down here. So for example, I may choose to differentiate based on their learning preferences. I may give some students the ability to hear it and create, let's call it auditory opportunities. I may give certain students an opportunity to read it because they learn best when it's visual for them. I may give them an opportunity to discuss it, to debate it, whatever that might be. All of those relate to learning styles. All of them relate to different levels of Bloom's. And I'm going to give you some examples very soon of Bloom's taxonomy. I'm sure you're basically familiar. The verbs are always nice, because when you can attach it to a verb, when you can attach it to an action, then you know, hey, I do this, or this is a nice idea, maybe I'd consider it. Having the students do X, Y, or Z, whatever those might be. Okay? So really, only when there's an extreme range of readiness would you consider different content for different students. In most cases, you're not creating different lessons. You're talking about what we might call layers or texture, things like that. How do I have nuances or different pieces in place available for students who can either do more or do different? Okay, again, we're talking in theoretical terms right now. We'll make it more practical in just a moment. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples. So just one more slide for reinforcement, because this is an important point. It does not mean teaching different content, but it means teaching it differently by adjusting levels of depth, complexity, as well as things like the readability of materials. Any questions here? I know that was a lot, so I want to make sure that we got it. Does anyone have an example of how they do this presently in their class? Yes?
So in the STEM class, I will, for a lesson on some computer programming with a specific software, I will teach new functions that the computer, new functions for the program, and then I will have the students break into groups and write a computer program using those functions, but they'll have maybe 3 options. One that's simpler, one more complex, and one very complex, so that they can choose which activity, using the same concept, all have to use the same concept, but which activity they would like to do is challenging for them.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
And then when they, if what's nice is that all 3 options are up there, and if students choose the first kind of beginner's level and they complete that, they can always move on to the next one if they have more time. So
beautiful.
It's also,
so what you actually did, in addition to responding to my question, which I thank you, is that you touched on something, at least I heard it, that's an important point that I was going to get to soon, which is that in many ways content and process tend to blur a little bit, meaning to say they go together kind of hand in hand. When we talk about differentiating the content, we oftentimes differentiate the process in terms of how we engage with that content. So what I heard was, as you were talking about different computer functions, you then talked about a process that followed, which allowed students, based off of either inclination or ability or something like that, to do certain things with it, right? So you've got the content side of it, which is, I might have, for example, to teach those computer functions, I might present it to them whole class, regular, conventional way. I may choose, for example, to have them read a book about it, and the books themselves might be on different levels, or to have them watch a YouTube video. And one YouTube video might be the computer programming for dummies version, and one of it might be more technical and more advanced. And certain students may be able to be there. Are you following what I'm saying? You can find that. You might find material that was really designed for, what grades are you teaching? 9th and 10th. You might have for, let's say, freshman college type classes, and you might have a few students that you're going to direct them to that YouTube video because they're ready for that. You feel like they're so there, they could already be, I find with technology in particular that people sometimes see quantum jumps, or they're sort of like the gap between the haves and the have-nots can be quite significant. And then you've got kids who really need the very basic tutorials. So they're both gonna watch a video, but the content will be different. And the beauty, because you mentioned technology before, I'm gonna come back in this direction, but the beauty of all of this is you've got so much more today than you had 20, 30 years ago. 20, 30 years ago, if you wanted to teach a difference between, you want to teach basic computer programming, what did you have available to you? You certainly had no YouTube, no internet, no videos were rare or hard to find and kind of cumbersome to put together and to access. You had to go to the library downtown and get the big, film reels and all this kind of stuff. It was very different. Today, we have so much more available to us, and that's really a blessing. The key thing is to be aware that we have it and to find ways to access it. And that's why it's so important. Please, what did you want to say?
In my classroom,
Yes.
I teach 6th grade language arts and social studies, so if there's a current events article
Uh-huh.
we're reading, I will have the class split into 3 different sections, not
Uh-huh.
necessarily groups, because there'll be a section of 4 or 5 students that read independently.
Go ahead.
And then they have some, I call it fast finishers, they
Uh-huh.
have fast finishing work they can complete.
Okay.
Another group works with a partner, they're not ready to be independent, and then the third group, I sit with them in a little round table,
Uh-huh.
and we work on reading a
Wow.
paragraph, and then I ask a question to see what they understand.
Go ahead.
What would you highlight as the main idea, things like that, and that group,
And you're guiding them.
yeah, they really
Okay.
need the teacher, and then eventually, I need to get to a point where they're rotating, so
Uh-huh.
they're not relying on, because I
Yeah.
find sometimes they rely on me too much.
I can imagine
And,
that. Trying to see if I have it on here. We're gonna
Yeah.
see it in the PowerPoint, something called TAPS. TAPS is together, alone. And then the other two, together, alone, paired, and then small group. Yeah. So it sounds like you got some tapping going on in
I
your
don't
class.
know.
Right, okay. I brought the wrong
And you know
heels
what, the kids
for
might
that.
like it if you
Yes.
make it fun like that.
Yeah, I do that sometimes. I try. And there's so many things you could do. Actually, I'm looking at the floor because I'm thinking about something. I mentioned kinesthetically earlier, but I actually had to teach a Talmudic concept because I was teaching Talmud about the length of the day, which in Jewish terms varies. It's not a 12-hour day, but it's longer seasons, shorter seasons. And I had the students do it by taking a tile, and every tile was 30 minutes. And they had to plot themselves on a timeline that they created as a physical entity. And sometimes you take a timeline like you have in your packet, which is a graphic organizer, and you sort of say, okay, make the timeline of the story, whatever that might be. But here, let's make the timeline of the Civil War, where we are physically the time. And every student has a different time, and they have to plot themselves accordingly. So for example, 1865 is going to be right over here. What are the steps that led up to 1865? Everything from Dred Scott and the Great Compromise and who knows what, to the aftermath of the Civil War on the back end of it, right? And they're actually physically plotting it, and you're giving them opportunity to be part of that process. So I think that was a great example, and I thank you for sharing that. Okay, so here are some examples. I gave you a space for that on the top of the second page, where we talk about content differentiation examples. We talked already about reading materials. So I thought you were going to mention perhaps something along those lines in your example, but there's a lot there when it comes to current events, right? Current events could be presented by Scholastic. They could be presented by a real adult level website, CNN, right? And if you wanted, for example, this is a good jigsaw. Let's say you want them at this point, since the field has sort of shrunk a little bit, and you want them to talk about the 4 leading remaining candidates, 2 Republican, 2 Democrat. So you have them put, I'll just say, Trump, Cruz, Clinton, and Sanders, okay? So you give them 4 different groups, and each one has their content. They have to learn about their candidate, who the person is, where they come from, what state they represent, what their key ideas are on specific issues. And then everybody learns in their environment, and then they go back to the original group, they teach each other, and then from there you do who knows, maybe a debate. Maybe everybody now takes on a character, and they have to debate the issue based on what they learned in their initial group. That's a differentiation model in practice.